So let me first take a step back and tell you like what we're advocating on during this pandemic a little bit. So we're focusing on three areas. Clearly, the legislation, and I can go more into that later, but legislation, COVID-related legislation for refugees and immigrants especially. Second, we are working on oversight. We are pushing Congress, especially on issues of, the fact that the border is closed and, refugees also are not being allowed in. And so those kinds of issues of oversight that we think Congress should be working on. And then also we are working on awareness, making sure that people both in this country, mainly in this country, know that refugees are our neighbors, but they do have different needs and how we can support them at this time. And also what refugees are doing with us in terms of uplifting our communities as well. So those are sort of what we're working on. In terms of how we're working, obviously, like everyone else, lots of Zoom meetings like this in terms of coalition work. And also especially working with the Congress. Now it's almost all phone calls. Obviously no in-person meetings, but definitely lots of phone calls, lots of emails, and lots of Zoom meetings like this is how we're doing the advocacy right now.
Absolutely. And how has your advocacy topic areas changed from where they were maybe early January to now during a COVID period?
Well, now, especially when we're working on legislation, it is like very COVID specific. What are the gaps? Because what are the gaps on how we can support refugees and immigrants, and working on those, right now. That's kind of the topic. So, like refugee agencies like us, and affiliates like LSS NCA. They've been affected in three ways, I would think. One is clearly, the refugees themselves are affected. So let me tell you, for example, we have a story about one of our refugees who came in, his name is Henry. He came in from Syria. He, has 6 children. We got housing through our affiliates. He got housing. He got a job in the hotel. He was well on his way to self-sufficiency when COVID hit and he got laid off. And so then, working with him, affiliates had to work more on, helping him file unemployment benefits, etc., rather than, supporting them getting to self-sufficiency. So because the refugees themselves have been affected. The ways that, affiliates have changed, or we also have changed our ways of working, trying to provide emergency funds. For example, for Henry, there was no other way. So basically we had to provide some emergency funds to make sure that he and his family won't be homeless. The affiliates are also working on making sure that both refugee families and even unaccompanied children do have facilities. Another issue, LIRS works with unaccompanied children, and refugee children. One of the things is just not getting foster families for these children, but also supporting those. For example, one little girl who we were supporting, Natalia, she had just been reunited with her mother just before the COVID hit. And while then the mother lost her job and there were financial issues, Natalia also had to, continue. She's 11 years old. She had to continue her English classes, etc., which was a challenge as well. So then, our affiliates were supported in trying to get computers, trying to get them connected with the schools, so that Natalia would have other connections as well to enable her to, when schools do reopen up, to be able to go to school. So those are the kinds of things that are affecting the refugees and immigrants that we work with. The affiliates and our refugee agencies, the other two. So we are learning how to also remote work. A lot of while it's difficult, clearly We are, instead of doing home visits, now we do what we call porch visits, where we would go, our affiliates would go to the porch and, try to talk through them or leave little care packages with thermometers, etc. A lot of, phone calls, etc. And then, focusing on the emergency. And because the issues have sort of been enlarged, for example, the issue of, self-sufficiency is not going to happen so quickly now. So, there's the issue of homelessness. So how do we as agencies support that and provide and make sure that that doesn't work? So that is another way we've changed our working both ways and, what we're looking at in terms of subject matter. And then, of course, the biggest and more long-term effect of what impacts refugee agencies at this time is the fact that, refugees aren't coming in, as well as the border being closed at the border, at the southern border. I think, there are several factors involved. So let me first talk generally of the refugee closures and IOM, and then about the EO. So one of the, because of all of the world, all over the world, everything's shut down, or, it's difficult to get the temperature, the medical clearances, etc. So, getting refugees to come over because of the shutdowns will take some time to sort of recover, come up to speed. What we really shouldn't put back is that there were refugees already who had got all of these checks and, already had visas with them. So they are ready to come over. And because of the delays, they might have to, one of the real fears is that they might have to go back and do everything all over again. So this is one of the things that we're pushing through legislation, et cetera, to try to make sure that, all these validity periods, the visas, et cetera, are automatically extended. That's one thing. So I think there is, as soon as there is easing up, if these are in place in terms of the flights, et cetera, that is possible. And also, especially with the refugees who are ready to travel and have been authorized to travel. Because we know, for example, you mentioned special immigrant visas. We know that there are about 1,000 special immigrant visa holders in Afghanistan, ready to come. But they haven't been able to, get the final, get on the plane, basically. So that's an issue. But, so that is something that we should keep in mind, and also keep understanding that, although that there is sort of a blanket, no fly kind of thing, there are flights, etc., and there are always exceptions. There are always exceptions, especially refugee minors, because there's probably more danger to them in the refugee camps of keeping them there. Especially if they've been cleared and got their visas, and they're such a small, the numbers are not, especially refugee minors, the numbers are not big. We are able to take them, we're able to, keep them in quarantine, whatever CDC guidelines, so that can be done. So we need to sort of keep that in mind and sort of keep pushing, saying, that yes, we understand why, everything can't be normal, but there can be ways of getting things done. That's number one. In terms of the EO, as you said, it doesn't affect refugees because there's a carve out for that. Well, it doesn't affect refugees, asylum seekers, and special immigrant visa holders, but it does affect you if you are a refugee or have been a refugee and now you have a green card. So it's basically family reunification for refugees if they're green card holders. So basically family reunification for green card holders and even actually citizens. So if you have become a naturalized citizen, or you are a citizen who has parents who are from abroad, you can't bring them over. So this is sort of it in terms of refugees and asylum seekers. It's sort of the chilling effect and the family reunification part, but overall, if it continues, it is simply also moving on to become sort of chipping away at the whole immigration fabric of this country, which is something that we don't want. And I think the justification for that in terms of economics is not there. We work very closely and lot of focus with allies in the DC space, advocacy allies as well. And one of the sort of gaps in the first, not the first package, it's the third package, but now also known as the CARES Act, the big stimulus package that was passed on March 27th. So that was the gaps of that was that there was no testing and treatment for all immigrants. So that is something that we're working on. So we're working on that. We are working on, as I said, the authorization for validity periods going forward, and also automatic authorization and extension of work, so your employment authorization. And this is important because in the CARES Act, there is a provision for unemployment for self-employed, for gig workers, for part-time, etc. And it also supports people who haven't had the normal unemployment work period, the time. So with a shorter time, you are able to get it, but you need your work authorization. And especially for refugees and immigrants whose work authorization is now expiring, an automatic extension of that would really support that. So those are what we are working on and pushing for, as well as more like the stimulus checks are not reaching all refugees and immigrants at this point, especially because there's a requirement for a social security number. And so it's something else that we're pushing. And some of that has been added to the HEORES Act, which was just introduced yesterday, and I could talk more about that later if you're interested. But we want it to become law. Sure. So the HEORES Act does a lot. And so the HEORES Act is, let me get that name correctly. It is the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act. It was introduced by the House 2 days ago. Yes, not yesterday, the day before. And it does, especially for refugees and immigrants, but definitely for all of us, it does address some of the gaps in the CARES Act. And one of that is definitely the stimulus check, where, we had even citizens of the US not being able to get the stimulus check, because if you filed jointly, you and your spouse did not have a social security, nobody in the family was getting this stimulus check. That's the way the CARES Act was written. So this was a big gap. So the HEORES Act does address that, with a taxpayer, that every taxpayer can get a stimulus check. That is one thing that the HEORES Act addresses. The HEORES Act addresses also the issue of validity periods for special immigrant visa holders. And I know that this is really important because in terms of medical checks, etc., those are really expensive. And if you're a refugee waiting to come, well, it's like $500. It's not easy. So making sure that, that just is extended. And also the extension of the employment authorization, automatic. So the HEORES Act does address those issues. One of the, one other thing that the HEORES Act does address is also that it extends it extends unemployment. It supports, DACA and temporary workers and TPS holders. It supports a lot of things. A couple of gaps that we see is, I was telling you that, at the beginning, I was telling you about how organizations like us and refugees who are already here need extra support in terms of transition and medical support, in terms of the issues of making sure that refugees aren't homeless, etc. So that has not been, there has been no funding put for that, in the sense that I think there is a sense of refugees are not coming, so why should there be any sort of funding? But people forget that refugees are our community, that there are many refugees and immigrants, etc., who are already a part of our communities, who are lifting up our communities, and they need support in different ways. For example, just the homelessness, but also connections, because one of the things that make refugees and immigrants different is that they haven't had the long-term connection. They don't have an employment history. They probably don't have credit history. And so it's not easy for them to get the housing, to get the, okay, you miss one payment, nothing's going to happen on your credit. So that kind of support, people have forgotten that they are within our community. And so that refugee assistance means that you would assist the entire community, like especially state and local communities that also support refugees and refugee support. So that's a big gap in the HEORES Act, that they have not provided funding for the Office of Refugee and Resettlement to support these.
And has the HEORES Act passed the Senate?
No. So the HEORES Act has just been introduced. It was introduced yesterday in the House.
Okay.
The day before in the House. And the House is supposed to vote on it on Friday. Hopefully it will then be voted on and passed. And then the Senate is hoping to take it up. When it probably is not going to be taken up very quickly. The Senate leadership has said, no, they don't want to get to it till June 1st. That is like one issue. I think these are clearly immediate needs that need to be addressed quickly. And then the second issue is that, we hope that when there's negotiations and when the final bill that everyone votes on and which would become law happens, that these priorities are in there, because these priorities are clearly not just that works for immigrants and refugees, it works for all our communities. So that's where I would appeal to all of our supporters, all of your supporters, that to ask that the main thing would be that these priorities remain in the final bill and are passed into law. The significance of these, especially the Refugee Protection Act, and the significance of that is to remember that it was bipartisan, but it was also passed during 1980. So like a time where there was stagflation. The economy was, in a stagflation at that time. People were still unsure in the same ways that we are unsure now of what the future would hold. But at that time, there was very little conversation saying where we got the negative conversation or negative narratives that are going on around refugees. So to understand that, right, like the situation right now where there's negative and sort of almost almost dyed in the wool narration of, refugees are bad or they're taking away our jobs. That was not always the narrative, and that shouldn't be the narrative. But we have had examples, especially of the Refugee Protection Act. We've had examples when the entire Congress and the president, so the entire government of the US understood that immigrants are definitely a part of the fabric of our nation, and they support this. And that is, I think, the legacy of the RPA, that we can do it, whether in times of calamity or in times of calm, that immigrants are definitely part of the fabric of our nation, and they support us. And obviously after that, the economy didn't crash because we let in so many refugees. So that argument is definitely something that, it does not work. So that's the legacy of those bills, and also of Refugee Day. In terms of what to do, I think the whole, I think it's a struggle to understand, but even the connections, like I would say, if you know someone who's a refugee or immigrant, just, to reach out. One of the things that, refugees and immigrants are used to, it's not a good thing, but it's also being in touch via Zoom, via WhatsApp, etc. Because the families are scattered. I can speak to myself. I'm always on WhatsApp with my family because they're not here, and I am an asylum. I sought asylum in 2009 myself. So that's one thing. So be in touch. Second thing is how to celebrate them is, there are a lot of events coming up. There is also to push the Congress, we will have sort of a vote, like we will have action alerts, and it's just not us, to push Congress to make sure not to forget communities that are supporting refugees, not to forget refugees, not to forget immigrants. So, make sure you take that action, make sure your voice is heard. And then generally, talk to someone else. Just on Refugee Day, just talk to someone else about, yes, refugees and immigrants, etc., are not the others. They are us, they are part of us, they're our neighbors, they are supporting us. So that is something that, that we should work on. So it's just as much, I think, as what we're doing now in terms of what it is a in terms of electoral politics to ensure again that the narrative is not for and against refugees, especially the last presidential election that came up as a topic. At this point, it is to understand and to push that refugees are much of a part of our fabric, and that the bad narrative against immigration as a whole is not supported by all of the American people, no matter what side of the political divide you are. That's the kind of presidential election narratives that we'll be pushing. So in terms of, right now, we're also, one of the things that we're also talking about is the presidential determination that would happen in the fall usually. And so now what happens to that when right now we are closed or the borders are closed at this point? So in terms of, the resettlement program, it remains a bipartisan program. So regardless, we are hoping that regardless of who will be elected, it will be that it will continue. It will be up to us and up to Congress to make sure, that it remains a robust program with funding, etc. So that would be sort of what we're looking at if both sides win. Either side wins, sorry.